Hi everyone, this is William with another episode of the the Romanov Dynasty of Russia. I started to say diary because I also have video series on the diaries of Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich. But this is Dynasty, the Romanov Dynasty of Russia. And if you're jumping in for the first time, I have a PhD in Russian history from the School of Slavonic and East European Studies, which was or is when I was first there, it was an independent school within the University of London system, and then the year before I left, it joined University College. So it's now part of University College, but that was quite some time ago because I graduated in 2000. So I did my dissertation on the relationship between the state and the dynasty in Russia in Imperial Russia as two parallel and sometimes rival institutions. And yeah, so the purpose of this video series is not so much to look at the Romanov rulers or the Grand Dukes and Grand Duchesses in a biographical sense, but to follow the course of what I was looking at in my dissertation, which is primarily Grand Ducal role. So what the service role was, if any, we will certainly be looking into that in detail, what the service role was of the Romanov Grand Dukes, those who were not considered heirs to the throne. And so we've talked before about how there weren't really any Grand Dukes from the time of the beginning of the dynasty in 1613 until Grand Duke Paul at the end of the 18th century, who finally had enough children and enough sons for them to be spared, for there to be spares, so to speak. And then in the 19th century, you had this incredible Romanov baby boom with lots of little Grand Dukes and junior branches of the family, which the dynasty had never had before and had to deal with that. And that's when questions really started coming to the fore about the service role of the Romanovs and who and what a Grand Duke served, if they served the state or if they served the emperor, and what if the state and the emperor were at odds with each other, going by various criteria. All right, so we have in the past few videos, we've talked about Muscovy, which existed before the Russian Empire came into existence. And it was not really, it wasn't a great power. It wasn't what you would think of as a modern secular state, even though, those did exist at that time in the 17th century. Muscovy was not one of them. And the first Romanov came to the throne, as I said, in 1613. And at that time, Muscovy was still a fairly insular, backward-looking state with the idea at the center of the Tsar being God's representative on earth, and the entirety of Muscovy, the entirety of what was then Russia, was the Tsar's own personal patrimony, and even the nobility served completely at his pleasure. They were you could even say they were his slaves. He didn't treat them as slaves, but if they wanted land, then they had to serve the Tsar personally. Usually as military leaders, raising their own troops, and Russia didn't really have a standing army. It had these noble militia groups that would come together. All right, so now we are up to the reign of Peter the Great, and last time we talked about how Peter came to the throne when his older brother died, leaving no children. very significant the fact that there was not only was there no succession law to say who legally would become the next Tsar, but there was actually not even someone that the Tsar had pointed to himself. He hadn't even on his deathbed said, well, I expect my brother Ivan to succeed me on the throne, or I expect my brother Peter to succeed me on the throne. So last time we talked about this very dramatic outcome of that slip on the part of Fyodor, not determining who would be his successor. And his two younger brothers had different mothers, and the different mothers came from different noble clans, and each noble clan wanted to make sure that its boy ended up on the throne. And there was this bloody denouement, and it was finally decided by a council of the nobles that both boys would reign as co-tsars of Russia, and that was the one and only time that has ever happened in Russian history. And it worked out, oddly, it worked out fairly well, because the elder brother Ivan was pretty extensively disabled, but he very much characterized what in the Muscovite ideal would have been seen as the meek and pious Tsar. Whereas Peter, though he was only 9 at the time, was this robust, intelligent, curious, already at that age sort of a force of nature, an exceptional child. And so they were put side by side on the throne, or rather, of course, they had their own 2 separate thrones under the regency of their older sister. So she was Peter's half-sister, and she was Ivan's full sister. Her name was Sophia, and she herself was given the title sovereign, although she was ruling strictly on behalf of her brother. She didn't end up seeing it that way. So Ivan died at 29, so not terribly young, but still young, and Sophia wanted to retain her role into the future indefinitely, and became one of the primary rivals and threats to Peter. So that was, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about that. Peter ended up outmaneuvering her and forcing her to go into a convent and take holy orders, and that put her out of the running. Once you'd taken holy orders or entered life in a convent, you could no longer play any political role. All right, so what are some of the highlights of Peter the Great's reign? Well, certainly he's one of the most dramatic of all the Romanovs, and as I said, really a force of nature. There are not many men like Peter the Great who come along in any culture or walk of life. And before I'd even thought about studying Russian history, I was going to a school in Portland, Oregon, and my family was living across the river in southwest Washington state, and I would take the bus across the river to the library at a local community college in Vancouver. I was in high school at that time, and I would have to wait for my mom or my dad to come pick me up. And while I was waiting at the library, I would just grab whatever book looked interesting. And I grabbed one on the Romanovs, and I was really just enthralled by what I was reading about Peter the Great. And I went on to read the Robert Massey book about Peter the Great and watch the miniseries with, who played Peter? Oh, I can't remember now. Maximilian Schell. And so that was kind of what pulled me in that direction to begin with. And then, rather ironically, even though I myself wasn't writing my dissertation on Peter the Great per se, I ended up with doing my PhD dissertation under the supervision of the late great Professor Lindsay Hughes, who was one of the world's foremost experts on Peter the Great. And so, yeah, I was very fortunate in that respect. And I will apologize to Lindsay if she's looking down on this project of mine if I make any big errors with respect to Peter and his reign. So yeah, this some of the other highlights of Peter's reign. Just going through quickly, he started as a child as the sort of boy Tsar. He was able to form his own two little regiments, little infantry regiments, the Preobrazhensky and the Ismailovsky, so that they would go out and they would have little scaled down weapons, but modern weapons, cannon and things like that. And they would have these games that became increasingly less like games and more like military maneuvers. So already at a very young age, he was preparing himself for that role. And then he also discovered that he had a great interest in naval power. He famously found a little boat in sort of just a storehouse or shed on the palace grounds when he was a child, and it had been given to his father, Tsar Alexei the First and Only, as a gift by some foreign power. And Peter was enthralled with it and took it out and learned how to sail on it. You know, it was a small boat. It had a mast and a sail, but it was very small. It was like a little one-person sailboat. And then he became enthralled with the idea of building a Russian navy, even though Russia did not have a warm water, ice-free port all year round. He still became obsessed with the idea of building a Russian navy. And he did things like going to Holland and incognito and studying shipbuilding and learning with his own hands to do shipbuilding in a Dutch shipyard. And this was the kind of guy he was. He had this just prodigious energy and ability to do things. Like I said, once in a generation in the world, you have somebody like this. So, yeah, coming into adulthood, he decided that what he wanted more than anything else was for Muscovy, his own patrimony in accordance to the old way of looking at Muscovy. He wanted it not to be what it was before, not to be his patrimony, but to be a modern secular geopolitical great power. That was the great vision that he had. And of course, at that time, he was not yet Peter the Great. He was Peter the First, Pyotr I, and this was his vision for Russia. And wasn't he just the right guy to bring such a vision into reality? So, with this in mind, he understood that in order to reach that goal, in order to establish itself as a great power, Russia needed to advance greatly in the fields of technology and of military advancement. And it couldn't get by just with militias anymore, and it couldn't get by with old-fashioned technology in general, whether it was, economic, that kind of technology with factories and that sort of thing, or whether it was with military weaponry. That needed to advance by leaps and bounds. And, it makes me think a little bit, I don't know how good of a comparison it is because I've never done a formal comparison, but it makes me think a little bit about what I read about Japan when it was modernizing, that it went from being really genuinely lost in time and backward compared to the rest of the modern world to just virtually overnight, through pure strength of will and determination and ability to learn, transforming itself into a modern state, and not only a modern state, but one that would become a great power in its own right, and that absolutely shocked not just Russia itself, but all of Europe, when in 1905 it managed to defeat the Russian Navy, to sink the entire Russian Pacific Fleet. and to beat Russia in the Russo-Japanese War. And this was the first time that any Asian power had defeated any European power. And that was not only shocking in itself to Europeans, but the fact that Japan had been able to do that so quickly, that sort of rapid, successful modernization is rare. And that's exactly what Peter set out to do with Russia. And so in order to do that, he was not only going to have to modernize the military and modernize technology, both military and non-military, but he was going to have to bring about something that was much more difficult, a change of consciousness amongst the nobility and the educated people in Russia. And he was going to have to make sure there were more educated people, and that the nobility were not on the model of the old boyars, but were like the modern nobility that could contribute to not just being at the feet of the sovereign, but to contribute to the building of this modern state. So, yeah, what were the institutions that needed to be changed? The military, the nobility, the church, the dynasty, the civil service, and even women in Peter's Russia, despite the fact that his chief rival for a while had been his sister, who was herself, she was definitely Peter's sister. She was a forceful presence in her own right, and she had a very unusual, very rare for a woman to be in the position that she was as the regent and the sovereign at that time. But even though his sister had been the main threat to him at one time in his life, he still wanted women to be out in public. So maybe not playing political roles, although he was open to that, but he wanted women to be in public view, because in other European countries, in modern European countries, women were not kept behind closed door. They were actually out, and they were part of the social scene, and Peter wanted that in his state. He didn't want the nobility to have beards anymore. So, there are famous accounts of how he would round up all the nobles and have their beards shaved and do the shaving even himself sometimes. So he wanted to put all his force behind modernizing all layers of society except two, the one at the very, very top and the one at the very, very bottom. So he did make some reforms to the autocracy, but he left the principle intact that there was one legitimate will and one legitimate ruler in Russia, and that was the Tsar alone. The Tsar would remain an autocrat. He would remain the final word on everything. But, as we'll talk about in just a few minutes, he did change things significantly with respect to succession law and with respect to what he himself was modeling. So he was providing sort of the definitive model of what a Russian emperor would be. And he would become the emperor of Russia in 1724. From then on, not just the Tsar, but the Gasudar Imperator, the emperor. And so he was the pioneer in modeling what a Russian emperor would be, and that model would prevail right until the end of the dynasty as one that every Russian autocrat or empress during the 18th century would have to find some way to live up to. All right, so the group at the bottom that was not modernized in any way, in fact, even went rather backward, was the peasantry, the serfs. So the serfs became even more strongly in serf. To begin with, serfs were bound to the land that they had lived on and worked on for generations, and they were not the personal property of landowners. But as a concession to the nobility, upon whom he was forcing so many changes and so much modernization, Peter left the people now enserfed as personal property and not just bound to the land. So if you were a member of the nobility who sold your estate and went someplace else, your serfs were your personal property. Maybe you would sell them with the estate, which would make sense, but you didn't have to. They were your personal property. So that was Peter's concession to the nobles to gain their cooperation in these reforms that he wanted to carry out. Okay, so how did he model this imperial rule that he wanted? What terms did he establish the relationship between state and dynasty on? What foundation did he establish it on, and what terms did he try to establish so that these two institutions would work seamlessly together, which needed to be the case? So, well, he voluntarily, openly, on several occasions, made it clear to people that he personally, Peter, their sovereign, regarded the state as more important than himself. So he made it clear that to him, Russia as a great power was more important than any single person, including the autocrat himself, any single person, any group of people. It was simply more important. So this wasn't encoded into law, but Peter, being such a forceful person, clearly didn't see the need to, or have the desire to code it into law. He still wanted to be indisputably the autocrat, but he seemed to think that through his succession law and through his personal example, he could make it clear to all his posterity that this was what a Russian emperor or empress needed to be. He needed to regard himself not as the center of the Russian universe, with Russia as his patrimony, but he needed to regard himself, or she needed to regard herself, as the servant of the state, with the preservation of the state being more important than the preservation of the life of the ruler, him or herself. So that just could not have been a bigger change between what the outlook and the worldview and the ethos was in Muscovy compared to what Peter set out to establish. And, he was absolutely consistent in that. In fact, he would end up in 1718 removing his own son and successor from the succession, and actually would ultimately kill his successor, because his successor, his traditional successor, his eldest son, was a strong opponent of Peter's reforms and wanted to take Russia back to the way everything had been in Muscovy. So however he felt about his son personally, and I don't think Peter had any real, he wasn't that kind of guy really, that he had any particular sentiment for his son. But, even if he had, he would have had to step in to make sure that he wasn't succeeded by Alexis unless he wanted to see everything that he had established be thrown out the window. Okay, so in so doing, on the other hand, if we looked at the dynasty itself and its future survival, he was willing to put the dynasty on very shaky terms. He was willing to put himself on very shaky terms in the sense of being the father of a future line of empresses or emperors or empresses, because he had two little boys that were still basically infants. I think the oldest one only made it to 3 or 4, and children died in childhood in vast numbers back then, even the children of a Tsar. And this was what the problem had been beginning with the first Russian Tsar, Michael, and then his successor, Alexis, and then his successor, Fyodor. They all died without being able to secure the succession where it could simply go from father to oldest son to oldest son. So Peter knew perfectly well that these two little boys were not any guarantee that his posterity going forward would inherit the Russian throne. The son that he killed was an adult. And, I've never heard of him having been in bad health. So when Peter killed Alexis, he was basically making, again, this statement: the state is more important than me. The preservation of the state is more important than the preservation of my bloodline going from father to son. He did have daughters, and his brother, Ivan, before he died, Ivan V also had fathered 5 daughters. But Peter's sons did indeed die before he did, the 2 little ones. And so that was the end of Peter the Great's male line posterity. And that was a risk he'd been willing to take. Okay, so with respect to the military, what was needed, if you wanted to build a modern military, what you needed first and foremost at the foundation was a modern professional officer corps. And, after that, you can take so many serfs, draft so many serfs in any given year and train them to be professional soldiers, but you can't start with that. You have to start by building a modern professional officer corps. And the Russian nobility had never seen themselves as being primarily soldiers. They had that role as the head of the militia, but they weren't, they were landowners. They were not living and working and having a career on a daily basis as professional officer corps officers. They had no notion of that. So that was at the very foundation of what Peter needed to build. And in order to build that, he needed to convince enough men who were prospective officers that they had a psychological investment in being professional officers. So what are the psychological underpinnings of being a professional officer, or for that matter, a professional soldier? If you're not giving your life for a person, then what are you giving your life for? Well, I think in the U.S. we would say the ideal has always been that we fight not for any person, but for the idea of freedom and liberty and the Constitution. And at Peter's time, what he needed in order to have a professional officer corps with its own military ethos was to have men who tied their own honor. So this idea of honor being, in the modern sense, tied into their identity as officers and tied into the ability of Russia to remain a great power. So they had a professional identity and they had a patriotic identity as not just Mother Russia, but Russia as a geopolitical great power. And that would be what allowed them to hold their heads high. So that, again, it may not sound that significant, but that was huge, and that was absolutely what he needed to do, and not something that's necessarily so easy to do quickly. And he turned to there was a foreign quarter in Muscovy, and from the time he was an adolescent in Moscow, from the time he was an adolescent, Peter had been fascinated with it and had gone there and had talked to foreign mercenaries and learned about military strategy and tactics and things like that. And so, he got a lot of help from foreigners in building his modern military and presenting a model to his own officer corps and getting that started on the right track. So it was, it was risky, wasn't it? Because now you have men who are not, who when they go to battle are not thinking, they're thinking of the dynasty, but secondarily to the state. And this would specifically cause problems. It would cause problems for Paul the First, who was seen as being disastrous in terms of Russia's status in the world, in terms of Russia's standing in its great power status. He was seen by foreigners as a bit of a crank and a laughingstock. And when Paul the First was assassinated by his own officer corps, it was pretty clearly with the complicity of his two eldest sons, who also had this idea of preserving Russia's great power status and not allowing Russia to become a laughingstock. And when Nicholas II was forced to abdicate, well, who forced him to abdicate? It wasn't the Bolsheviks. It was the general staff officers. It was the upper echelon of the professional military, including Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolaevich, who had gone to and graduated from the General Staff Academy. And in the 1870s, the General Staff Academy would be at the very forefront of the reforming attitude. And Peter really created this schism and this fault line between, within the Russian consciousness. And the General Staff Academy would be very much state-centered and, professional, in favor of a very professional modern military. And Nikolai Nikolaevich would imbibe that, and he would, going forward, at the time of the of Nicholas II's abdication, it really is not surprising at all that he sided with his fellow general staff generals. Okay, so that's an example going forward. And here, in terms of how Peter modeled this himself, for instance, he said, on the eve of the Battle of Poltava, he told his troops that they were fighting not for him, but for, in quotes, the state entrusted to him. So again, presenting himself as the servant of the state, which is very, very significant. So how did Russia establish itself as a military great power? Well, basically by going to war with Sweden. So Sweden was a great power at that time, a very powerful great power led by a young king who was, a forerunner of Napoleon, let's say. He was a military genius. Charles XII, very interesting person if you want to, go do some additional reading. Charles XII was a fascinating person. And he invaded Russia, and he's one of the people who would later be cited when Hitler invaded Russia, and it was said, well, he should have looked at history. He should have looked not just at Napoleon, but at Charles XII, who ended up losing to Russia, and it was as shocking to the other European powers at that time as it was in 1905 when Russia itself lost to Japan. It was a very, very long and drawn-out war, unlike the Russo-Japanese War. So Russia suffered a huge loss at the Battle of Narva in 1700, but Peter the Great was determined. He was not going to give up. And in 1709, Russia won a huge victory at the Battle of Poltava, and this was commemorated by the entire, all the men of the Russian imperial family, all the Grand Dukes, including Grand Duke Dmitry, led by Nicholas II, went to Poltava, and there was this massive celebration of that. So, another point of continuity in the Russian consciousness and in the Romanov consciousness. But everything wasn't really finalized so that Peter could say, okay, this is it. We are unequivocally now a military great power until about 1721. And in 1722, he issued his succession statute. So for the first time in its history, Russia had an actual law with respect to its rulers. and it would stand until 1797, when Paul I, for reasons of his own, would change the succession law to be one of strict male primogeniture. So a tsar, an emperor at this point, could only be succeeded by his eldest son. That was written into law, and it was not his own choice. But Peter, in keeping with his idea of himself as the protector and servant of the state, issued a succession law that gave the emperor the right to choose his own successor. So he still acknowledged that ideally this would be an eldest son, but it was now absolutely legal for the Tsar to choose anybody he wanted to be his successor. He could point out the window and say, that little girl selling flowers is going to be my successor. And of course, he wasn't, well, he almost did that, but, that wasn't what he had in mind, but that was what he enacted into law. And Peter was very much aided by having a great PR man, you could say, during his reign, a fellow called Prokopovich, who was a scholar and who was the great propagandist and presenter of Peter's vision of what Russia should be. And Prokopovich said of this 1722 statute, he described it as a kind of prophylactic or preventive medicine for the monarchy of all the Russias. So because of the fact that it would allow the emperor to choose the most able person to succeed him, and not merely his eldest son, not even necessarily a man. And Peter ended up choosing a woman, in fact, but we'll get to that. So, that was fine so far as it went. So long as Peter himself was the ruler, he was never going to betray that deeply held principle that he had of putting the state first. But how would this work out going forward? Well, it would work or wouldn't work to begin with, to the extent that his successors were indeed willing to embrace this imperial view of Russia. And then the time arrived when that view of Russia's great power status being more important than anything else, eventually that would become a point of threat and danger between the dynasty and the state, because you had this professional officer corps that was no longer willing to look at a tsar who they considered a weakling or a laughingstock as a legitimate tsar. And in fact, Paul's officer corps would end up giving him the name the Tsar Cripple, even though he was not actually crippled. But that was how they saw him. All right. So next time we are going to get into one of the most important reforms of Peter the Great, the one that really affected the nobility and really transformed the nobility from the boyars into civil servants and military men. And this was Peter's table of ranks. So he created a table of ranks not only for the military. Everybody knows the military has ranks, but also for the civil service and for education and for every public aspect of the entire Russian state. If you didn't have a rank, you were no one. If you stayed at home on your estate and didn't serve, you would never get a rank. So if you wanted to get anywhere in Russia, no matter who you were, you had to have a rank, and you had to go up the table of ranks. And if you reached a certain level, you would be ennobled. And in fact, to this day, I believe, or at least at the time when I got my dissertation, or got my PhD, I was a little jealous of people getting their PhD in Finland, because if you got a PhD in Finland, you got a sword. And that was a token, an atavistic or anachronistic token going back to when Finland was part of the Russian Empire. And when any person, any scholar, any person who moved up in the university hierarchy also had to have a rank that was equivalent to a military rank, and getting the sword would be a sign that you had reached the level of automatic ennoblement, although it no longer means that anymore. Anyway, one thing I didn't talk about was Peter's creation out of nothing but empty swampland of the western capital of Russia, St. Petersburg, as a rival to Moscow, not only a geographical rival, but a rival in terms of world view and ideology and the idea of the Russian soul. All right, wow, 40 minutes. I didn't think I was going to go longer than 20 minutes, but I guess I'm a hard person to shut up when it comes to these favorite topics of mine. So yeah, I hope to see you next week. Bye.